Okay, everybody, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunches and welcome back for session 3 of this afternoon's presentations. This is Site and Building Strategies for Addressing Water Inundation. Christina I always get it wrong. Pukwatka, Preservation Project Manager for Historic New England, will be the moderator for this session. The panel presentations will be followed up by a panel discussion plus a Q&A session with the attendees to wrap up this session. Please join me in welcoming Christina as the moderator for this session.
Hello, thank you, Stephen. I hope everyone enjoyed their lunch and feels re-energized for the afternoon. As Stephen said, my name is Christina and I'll be your moderator for this session. First up, we will hear from Rodney Rowland, who is the Director of Facilities and Environmental Sustainability for Strawberry Bank Museum. He'll speak on stormwater management at the structures of the organization, all of which are located closely together, like kind of in a complex area in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Next, Julie Larry, Senior Architectural Historian with Black Diamond Consultants, will speak on behalf of Greater Portland Landmarks, and will touch on flooding in the Greater Portland area and various improvements that can be implemented to help protect a structure from flooding. And then finally, we'll hear from Ben Havoc, who is Team Leader of Property Care for Historic New England. He will touch on climate action planning efforts, both large and small, at the organization's 41 sites located throughout New England, including 2 here in Salem, the Phillips House and Gedney House. And while you are hearing from these 3 speakers, please think of some questions or comments you might have so we can have a very thorough question and answer session afterwards. All right, so first up, please welcome Rodney.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. One correction to my introduction. As of 4 weeks ago, and due to Strawberry Bank's commitment to solving the flooding issues that you're going to hear about, I am no longer Director of Facilities, but just Director of Environmental Sustainability. So that's going to be my focus until I decide to retire, I think. So I just to make sure everybody in the room knows about Strawberry Bank. We're a 9-acre site very close to the banks of the Piscataqua River in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. We have 37 historic structures, most of which are on their original foundations. So our goal is to teach the visitors to Strawberry Bank how the existing neighborhood has evolved through time. We haven't moved a lot of structures there. So we're very site specific, and so we're not looking to move a lot of our buildings. We really don't want to alter the neighborhood as we think about resiliency. So that's a big point for us and a big challenge. So Strawberry Bank is this entire city block right back in here. And then this piece of land right here, which I'll talk a little bit today, is Prescott Park, owned by the city. Same view, just in the opposite direction. Just pointing out our winter activity is a 12,500 square foot skating rink that we opened for 3 months. But you can see the river is right here, and elevation is clearly an issue. But what really affects us the most is the fact that before 1903, when the city folded in, the large field that you saw where the skating rink is located was actually what they called puddle dock or dock. It was a tidal inlet, and it allowed the large vessels to anchor out here in the river, and large barges called gondolas would bring the wares into wharves that they constructed along the waterway. So with that being filled in, it doesn't mean the water isn't there anymore, and that's certainly a central issue with the groundwater problems that we're facing and what I'm talking about today. The best evidence of that is the city's flood projections. You can see this is the FEMA flood projections over the city of Portsmouth map. So you can see all of the buildings along that low green area, which was the dock, is the projected flooding. And then interestingly enough, because water has a memory, it's basically trying to connect back to what is now the South Mill Pond, which is what it did historically back in the 1600s. So groundwater is a little bit less known issue, and a lot of research is going on with it. These are some projections out of the hydro predictions that came out at a conference just in June. And you can see in our particular area, there's a lot of major concern about what the water is going to look like. And you can see, especially right here, which is where Puddle Dock used to be, what groundwater is going to do with being influenced by the Piscataqua River. We've been seeing this in our basements of our houses certainly for the last 3 decades. As long as I've been at Strawberry Bank, we've talked to people who used to live in the buildings back in the 50s, and they remember sort of a damp smell to the basements. So I think this has been an increasing problem for decades, actually. And this is kind of what happens. The groundwater perks up from underneath the large field, and then the rains fall from the sky, and there's no perking. The water has no place to go. So we have this huge lake that forms. It gets to our stone foundations and floods the buildings all along what's known as Puddle Lane. My focus today is going to be on the Penhallow House. This is a 1758 structure that was actually moved to our campus in 1862. So we consider our own, even though it was moved here. It's been there a long time. And unfortunately, unbeknownst to them, they put it right on the creek that used to go from the Puddle Dock and lead to the South Mill Pond. And so this building has been suffering from huge quantities of water and high relative humidities in the basement forever. And so we had to address how to take care of both the relative humidity and the issues associated with the standing water. This just gives you a little background. This is the Penhallow House right here. Here's that 1813 map showing you the dock. And then before, the water used to trickle right through and head back to the South Mill Pond. So, and this is a modern map picture today where the Penhallow House is. So this is some of the serious water we're dealing with. These are some images showing you what we decided to do. We didn't want to change the context of the building in relationship to the streetscape. Again, that's really central to what we're interpreting. So we decided to elevate the building, go underneath, and remove the existing foundation, putting in a very thick permeable membrane, which you can see in these images, covering it with eventually 3 to 3.5 feet of crushed rock against a new poured concrete foundation, which you can see in these images, both the forms going in and then the actual concrete that's been poured. This allows us to create what's called a wet-proof basement. We're going to invite the water to come and go as it needs or wants to, with the idea that we have systems in place to get rid of the water when the Piscataqua River will take it. So our biggest challenge is that our drainage system connects to the Piscataqua River, and that's tidal. This drainage system is impacted 100% when the tide is high. Never mind an astronomical high tide or a storm surge, it doesn't work. It's full of salt water. And so ours is a timing issue. How much water do we need to store until the river goes out and allows that water to drain away? And so this is the calculations that our engineers came up. It's an interesting process. These are images of the spray foam that we had to put onto the foundation, which is twofold. One, it's to help us with the humidity question that I brought up earlier, but also it has to be fire retardant because we're planning on putting residential apartments in half of the building. So we have to have a fire rating. This is them loading in that crushed stone that I talked about. Again, it's 3.5 feet. It's quite thick. And this is the good news, that huge storm that we had in January, which saw the highest recorded tide in the Piscataqua River ever. It filled up the basement above the crushed rock, as you can see, just as we had hoped. And then when that tide went out in 2.5 hours, it drained away. So this was our hope, that we would have enough space for that water to come and go, but not impact the undercarriage of the building. We did put in some insurance, if you will. You can see these little pockets right here. There's actually 4 of them. Those are going to be flood vents. So if the water begins to creep up onto those joists or close to the joists, it's going to spill out behind the back of the house and go into some newly established rain gardens that I'll talk about. And we also embedded a hard-piped sump pump in the center of the basement, which will go out on Washington Street at the front of the building. You can see it right there. And that's sort of a last-ditch effort. It'll be battery-operated pump. If we need to pump it, we will, but that's hopefully never going to be needed. So, just to talk a little about the surface flooding, because this building is impacted on that as well. In the spring, we're going to be implementing mountable curb. Basically what's happening is the city stormwater is coming down both sides of Washington Street to this low point, and then it floods our property, which isn't something that we should have to deal with. The city's our partner. They're going to help us with this, but we're going to put in a mountable curb, which will give us about 5 inches and cause the flooding to happen in the street as opposed to on our land. We're then going to be changing the elevation of our street, bringing it down 6 to 8 inches so that we have positive pitch away from the Walsh House, which is the historic house that's here, and Penhallow House. And that will go to some newly established water runoff areas and then bioretention areas both here and up on Wooden Place, because all the water comes down this way, and it used to come down this way. So we're going to break that water load in half. We're going to send half of it up to this area where there's an existing storm drain, and then we're going to send the other half to this newly created storm drain. And again, it's a waiting game. The water will stay there till the Piscataqua River tide goes out and the stormwater system begins to work again. So, and that's my time. Thank you very much.
Oh, there they come. Nope, I see them, they're coming up. Hi, I'm Julie Larry, and I'm an architectural historian, and I was formerly the Director of Advocacy for Greater Portland Landmarks, which is a regional nonprofit. And while with Greater Portland Landmarks, we initiated a project to increase our understanding of the potential impact of increased flooding and storm surges in our regions, on our region's historic resources rather, and to determine what strategies could be taken to prevent or mitigate those impacts. In particular, our concerns are with two communities currently experiencing flooding impacts, Portland and South Portland. This is the Portland waterfront here. Portland is the arm on the top left of your screen, and South Portland is at the bottom. And as you can see in this image, the highest projection scenarios, which are the bright yellow-green that have been mapped by the Maine Geological Survey, are anticipated to significantly inundate large neighborhoods in both communities. For our project, we initially selected two neighborhoods, Bayside in Portland, which is, let me see if I can, this is Bayside, and Ferry Village in South Portland, which is this neighborhood right over here. Bayside neighborhood is approximately 238 acres at risk of inundation, and South Portland's Ferry Village is about 175 acres. The two selected neighborhoods are vulnerable because they are coastal neighborhoods, but they are also in large part at risk due to a history of fill projects for land development. In recent years, Portland's neighborhood has been experiencing recurrent sunny day flooding, as well as significant flooding events like depicted here in this storm, which was December of 2012. That's a significant amount of flooding that was exacerbated in part because the infrastructure underneath with the rising water collapsed, and there were water main breaks, which exacerbated all of the problems. Taken from a very similar location, this one in 1939, we know that the neighborhood even back then was experiencing periods of flooding events on what appears to be a fairly nice day while these boys were out playing. So we at Landmark set out to raise awareness in the region as what could be lost due to the impacts of climate change, but also for our advocacy and education programming, we needed to focus our ongoing surveys on historic resources because we didn't know exactly what could be lost. And then we also wanted to engage in policy discussions on a broad level, but also help historic homeowners and property owners with what they could actually do and what they could design for those who don't have their own facilities personnel in their home. So in 2018, we received a Historic Preservation Fund grant from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission to document historic resources in those 2 targeted neighborhoods. We used summer interns to complete the field work, and we had them record the usual historic features that architectural historians doing historic resource surveys go out and do. But we also worked with the 2 sustainability offices in each city to come up with a list of features they were interested in documenting, and we had our surveying field interns do that work. So they were looking at things like, where do the utility entrances come into the property? What is the level of the first floor of habitable space? What are some potential flooding vulnerabilities and site features like visible stormwater flow? Are there fences? Are there mature trees that are providing shade? Items like that. So let me just tell you a little bit about each neighborhood in a little bit more in depth. Bayside's shoreline was first altered to accommodate railroad lines in the mid-1800s and was last altered by the construction of Interstate 295 and several connecting arterial streets during urban renewal. And this map shows the changing. The original shoreline was up here. The shoreline is now down here. So it's a significant section of the neighborhood that was filled. And this goes from the 1830s to the present day. Bayside is a neighborhood with some of Portland's oldest housing stock, mainly in the Greek Revival style, as it was mostly untouched during a catastrophic fire in Portland in 1866 that left about 10,000 Portlanders homeless. It also contains some 20th century industrial properties like the Schlotterbeck and Foss building down here, which is on the National Register of Historic Places and was recently rehabbed using historic tax credits. It also has some mid-20th century modern properties like the former Portland Motor Sales building, one of my favorite buildings in town, which is unfortunately a U-Haul storage building. But yeah, but it's there, waiting for rehab. Unfortunately, Bayside was also a dumping ground for a lot of the fill that happened during the fire of 1866, and that sort of helped propel some of those infill and landfill projects that happened in the 19th century. Whoops. So the historic resources identified a significant number of historic dwellings and commercial buildings in the neighborhood. Each orange dot is a historic resource that's located within the predicted inundation areas, and each dot is a linkable dot that goes to that supplemental survey form that was created by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission to document the potential climate change vulnerability features. Across the river in Ferry Village is one of the earliest settlement areas in South Portland and is adjacent to a large area of the city that was filled initially for residential development. The residential development was later taken down, and fill projects were expanded for the Liberty shipyards during World War II. These lands were then redeveloped for fuel storage tanks associated with the Portland and Montreal pipeline. Portland Harbor was a winter harbor for many decades for Canada. The World War II era fill and development unfortunately blocked off a natural stream known as Jerry's Brook that flowed through Ferry Village into the harbor. The village is traditionally been a working class neighborhood, established in the mid-18th century. It's largely associated with the working waterfront and includes some higher style examples of Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, Italianate, and Second Empire, but is mostly comprised of vernacular structures. And what we learned during our survey is that many of the dwellings close to the former stream, or Jerry's Brook, are experiencing recurrent basement flooding during high tides, even during sunny days, as well as during significant rain events. As in Bayside, Ferry Village Historic Resources Survey identified a significant number of properties within the potential inundation area. So following up on that work, we received a New Century Community Grant in 2019 from the Maine Historic Preservation Commission to create a property owner's manual that outlined adaptation strategies using the properties and findings from the Historic Resources Survey as case studies. The guide features case studies with mitigation strategies for several properties in each neighborhood located in or adjacent to the predicted inundation areas. These are some in the Portland area here. And then, as I mentioned, the survey work identified common vulnerabilities in both neighborhoods. We were able to look at that data, look at what the percentages were in each neighborhood, and come up with what the most likely vulnerabilities were and attach some potential strategies to them. So the Proper Owner's Guide outlines how an owner can first identify their own individual vulnerabilities for their property, and then suggest strategies for making improvements for the most common issues, like low or below grade basement windows and openings that you see here. We also cataloged things like negative site drainage and gave some strategies on how a property owner might be able to reverse that. How to control stormwater runoff, how to deal with flood-prone basements and what you should be doing with your utilities and other features that you have in your basement, how to potentially look at moving low utility entrances, and how for our commercial properties in these areas, how a potential property owner might deal with at-grade commercial entrances. The guidebook is free and it's available on Greater Portland Landmarks website at this address. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name's Ben Havoc. I'm the team leader for property care for Historic New England. And maybe I'm going to change gears a little bit. I'm going to talk about rain and localized flooding. These are issues that really affect the properties that I deal with. So these inundation rains that overwhelm our gutter systems or again lead to basement flooding and all sorts of shenanigans. That leads to, of course, building damage, object damage, and mechanical system damage. So it's something we think about constantly. And of course, as we all know, it's raining a lot more these days. So who am I and who do I represent? I represent Historic New England. We're a regional preservation organization. We have a lot of different program areas, but the one I'm involved in is the homes, farms, and landscapes. And to put that in context, we oversee 41 historic properties, which is 167 structures and 1,300 acres of land from Rhode Island up to Mid-Coast Maine. So we're kind of regionally spread apart. And then my team, the property care team, is responsible for the preservation and maintenance of all of this real estate. So we do everything from brush clearing to garden restoration, from mechanical systems to the roofing jobs. In 2023, we adopted a climate action. A climate action plan for Historic New England. Our Board of Trustees adopted this. We have some major kind of goals, but the one we're focused on today is the managing our properties to meet high preservation standards, but also kind of recognizing maybe we have to adapt to ensure resiliency in the face of weather extremes and sea level rise. So if we're going to talk about that, we should give a little baseline. And of course, anecdotally, we knew for a very long time that we were at risk for inundation rains and localized flooding. In fact, we think about it, like I said, all the time, because every storm is just slamming us. But we didn't have a lot of data. And so our sustainability coordinator, Joie, who's here, Joie, raise your hand. She did a risk assessments for all of our properties, which, we analyzed, and it wasn't surprising. Again, the greatest risk for every one of these properties was wind and precipitation, and most of the windstorms come with rain. So it's windy rain plus regular rain, and those are our big risks. But again, like I said, we're a big regional organization, and what exactly is happening on the ground? So Joie has been helping us track and analyze actual storm event data. So every storm, we're tracking what the storm was, how it hit the different sites, what the weather was in the different, our different zones, plus then what was being reported as damage. Again, no surprise, we're very focused on kind of wind and rain events. So what are we doing about that? Well, we've been doing things for a very long time, over 3 decades of emergency preparedness and response. But really by 2006, 2007, we started really kind of responding to the events and trying to figure out how do we mitigate them in the future. So we didn't really associate it directly with climate change at the time, but that's what we were doing. So the first thing I'll say is, like, don't forget, just keeping your buildings in good repair is a resiliency thing. Of course, every grant I do is called exterior repairs and resiliency or something like that. But that's what we're doing. We're trying to keep the water out. That's what all those systems are for. So it's our first line of defense for the buildings. In 2018, we did a study, also through the Maine Historic Preservation Office, grant through there, where we analyzed our gutter capacity. And we thought we were being proactive because we were like, ooh, let's look at and measure our gutters and how much water they move so that we can start planning for, the future of climate change and how they're going to perform. And of course, we realized very quickly that none of our gutters really could perform in the inundation rates we were getting. And in fact, this is one of my favorite images, but look at the trough size on that historic gutter. I mean, you're carrying nothing with that. And then what we especially realized was most of our gutters had, it might have been big enough, the trough might have been big enough, but then the little outlet leading to the downspout, horribly small. That's why the water's pouring over the sides. It's not that it needs to be cleaned, it actually needs a bigger outlet, a bigger release valve. For over a decade, we've been thinking about stormwater management on our sites, not just the gutters, but how water is performing on the sites. And the approaches we developed, 10, 12 years ago are still pretty effective. They're working well at our sites, and it's a holistic look. So we're thinking about how all the water is interacting, all the stormwater once it hits the site, and implementing major site-wide projects, including drainage systems and moving water. And finally, actually, since we started that before we realized the gutters were undersized, finally tying the gutter work into the drainage work, all just to get water away. But you can't always do these gigantic holistic site-wide projects. They're very expensive and they take a long time to plan and implement. There's archaeology involved, all of those things. So we don't want to forget some of the other things, like just grading away from the buildings, pretty effective. Let's keep the water from pooling next to your foundation. We're starting to explore with these with rain gardens as a potential place for our water to go. And of course, the small efforts count. Like if you can't even get to those things, just make sure your gutters are clean, which is a challenge. And then, this hot mess. Someday we're going to get a drainage system there, but at least they're trying, right? We're trying to get the water as far away from the buildings as possible. And then in our basements, deploying the sump pumps to keep the, once the water gets in the basement, get them out, the dehumidifiers to dry out the space. And then every storm, we're deploying where we know water's going to get in, despite our efforts. So just keeping that in mind. So I threw up some general guidelines. These are actually some things I gave to a consultant when we were starting to talk about one of our sites, which includes, that any intervention, we deal with historic house museums, so we're always thinking about how the intervention kind of impacts the historic experience at the site. Of course, anything below grade is going to require archaeology. We're very, we're a preservation organization. We talk about in-kind replacement all the time. Well, replacing our gutters in-kind it's not effective anymore. We really need to be thinking about upsizing the gutters and downspouts. Site drainage is major. Whether you do the big project or that small, grading project, it's really important. And everything we do is trying to do gravity-based so that we're also not dependent on power for the pumps to get things away. So all of our thought, that's our first target. And with that, I'm done. There's some thank yous, there's some funders up there, but thank you.
Now that's on. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ben, Rodney, and Julie. That was very interesting. It's interesting to see improvements, both small and large, can make big impacts, whether it's an organization with many structures or a one-off structure, or organization that just has one building, or even a private homeowner, can all do different things to help protect themselves from climate change. So for the next little bit, we're going to do a little panel discussion, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. So first, this is for Ben and for Rodney. I was wondering how you guys prioritize, since you do have so many structures with your organizations. How do you prioritize what work gets done in terms of climate change?
Well, that's always the hot topic, right? How do you prioritize? And to be honest, we just scheduled our first meeting, or have I scheduled that yet? I'm about to schedule our first meeting, where we start looking at that data that we're collecting and actually say, where are we getting hit? Like, we now have more quantitative data, so we can start saying, well, maybe we need these small initiatives here, but the site drainage big project needs to go at this other site. So we're starting to use this weather data to inform the decision-making process.
I think maybe we have it a little easier than Ben in that we're a campus as opposed to spread across several states. And so in June of last year, we came out with a stormwater management plan for the whole 9-acre site. It identified 7 areas of concern, and so we're starting to pick away at those. The Penhallow, Washington Street area is area of concern 2, so that'll be addressed in the spring of next year. And now we're working on areas of concern 6, 7, and 3, which is sort of the huge water retention area on Puddle Dock. So we're kind of handling them that way, area of concern by area of concern. And then for the groundwater, it's really a building by building analysis and doing the minimum that we have to do to keep the groundwater out.
Great, thank you. Julie, when you were with Greater Portland Landmarks, did you find a lot of private homeowners coming to you guys for advice? And if so, did you find that a lot of them were a little concerned that the price tag of what needed to be done was a bit of a deterrent to do the work?
We do. It's a lot of phone calls and people stopping into the office. That's the bulk of the work, I think. I think even more challenging than the cost was understanding what they had to do. Why is this happening? They haven't done, a building study. They don't know why the water is rising on a sunny day in their basement. So it's just first getting that education and teaching them how to analyze what's happening in their building and what the potential reasons might be, and then figuring out, what the best means forward and phasing that potentially for some of them. So while we couldn't specifically, because of the broad nature of the homeowner's guide, give specific costs, we did try to rank them in terms of costs and in terms of ease and, what's a temporary low-cost solution, and so while you save up for them, maybe the more costly solution.
Thank Thank you. Going to throw it back to Ben and Rodney again. And again, it's kind of a tag team question. How do you guys feel that organizations can work together to do this? Because we're not working in a vacuum. Earlier, we heard from the House of Seven Gables, so Historic New England, Strawberry Bank, Sturbridge Village, like all the different organizations. How do you guys think we can all come together and learn from each other so we're not like reinventing the wheel?
I think, in my opinion, the Keeping History Above Water Conference was a great initiation to that concept. And we became really dependent on it. It was our, one time or two time a year where we all got together and talked about our woes, and then of late, some of the solutions that we're implementing. So that was very helpful, both from an intellectual, but also from a mental standpoint, mental health. But I think, we're always talking. Ben has a roundtable with all of us that we meet every quarter or so, share notes, compare ideas. The House of Seven Gables and Strawberry Bank have been working together probably for a year or so. I talk for them, they come up and they talk for us. And so I think it's just, sharing your phone number and your email and just keep the communication open for us.
I don't have too much more to add to that. I think it's the networking and not being afraid to, share your woes with your colleagues. All of those images Rodney was showing, we have a house just on the other side of the street from the Penhallow house. And we've done very little there for planning, but I'm always talking to Rodney because I know he's doing the planning for me. He doesn't know it, but he is. But then he just asked if we would participate in a groundwater, study, because that's of great interest. And of course, that's something that's great interest to us. So it's networking and going to things like this and seeing what other people are doing, and then not being afraid to say, gosh, I have no idea about geothermal. I just visited a colleague and got tours of their geothermal systems. So, it's that kind of thing.
Awesome, thank you. Julie, do you find that the officials in Portland are, is there a lot of red tape in the city, or do you find that they're pretty open to the changes? And then also, I'm not well versed, I'm assuming there's a historic district commission. What are they feeling?
So South Portland does not have a historic preservation group to the extent, there's sort of informally. But there is a very strong historic preservation commission in the city of Portland. It is a city, there is red tape. But both communities do have strong sustainability coordination programming. And I mentioned we worked with both of them in both communities in terms of what they wanted to see for data gathered. Generally, I would say that both communities are working on very large-scale sustainability issues around infrastructure primarily, rather than individual projects like that a homeowner or a small scale in a neighborhood. And I would say that the development, it was mentioned earlier today, there is the neighborhood in Ferry Village, all that area that was filled for the shipyards, there's now a massive redevelopment project. And so it hasn't, like their development hasn't really coordinated with their desire for sustainability and resilience planning yet because of income tax and property taxes, yeah.
I'm from South Carolina, and I went to undergrad in Charleston, and that's where we're at. It floods when literally it's a sprinkle out, and there's high rises and just all the new construction, and we're just like, please stop.
And I'll just add that the Bayside neighborhood is, a large chunk of it is owned by the Portland Housing Authority, which is doing a massive long-term housing plan. And some of us don't believe it's the best place to put the most vulnerable in the community, but that's where they own the land, so.
Again, another tag team question for Ben and Rodney. When you guys are planning projects for your buildings, do you guys try to find ways to work in climate change action? So if you're doing a roofing project, do you try to upsize the gutters, upsize the outlets? And then also, how does, again, prioritizing, if something, if a preservation project needs to happen, but obviously we need to do some work in terms of climate change, where do you prioritize those two types of projects? Regular just preservation, if wood's rotted, versus actually getting a building prepared for these intense rainstorms, droughts, and water rising?
What a horrific question. There's
Thank
so
you.
many.
That is also my
so many-
supervisor,
Yeah,
so.
that's right.
Hitting the hard-hitting questions.
Well, I think that's the challenge always is, and, we're dealing with a gigantic portfolio and not enough money, so prioritization is always the key. We have, I think, fairly successfully integrated climate change into like every project question, but we still kind of miss some, along the way, and I think that will continue to get better and better. But in terms of prioritization, I think I've got to protect the buildings, and if the short term means I'm not doing, the massive climate change, thing in favor of, getting a roof on or, painting it, that's still going to protect the building, and it gives me time. I mean, we just made some, we're also looking at not just resiliency but mitigation, and we're unfortunately making some decisions about not making upgrades right now because we're just not quite ready to make certain, system changes, whether they might affect the museum collections, they might affect the buildings. And so, it's hard because we have this, climate action plan and we're trying to be carbon neutral by 2050, but we're also, you can't rush into things that are going to then damage the building. So I think you always have to kind of weigh that. Are you getting too far ahead of yourself in that?
Yeah, we do. I think in my new role, it's going to be to really make sure that any facilities-related projects bring in sustainability or resiliency work. And it's not only because it's necessary. I mean, we're an organization that struggles to can keep maintenance on our buildings because we have so many to maintain. And so finding ways to make them more resilient is really important, both for the budget and just for our ability to maintain them. I also think if you're an organization that's dedicated to getting the word out and really talking about resiliency and sustainability, which are the real hot topics right now, you want that piece of every project you do. You want to make it a very visual and audible message that you're sending out after a project. So whether you're putting up signage to talk about it, whether you're coming to events like this and talking about what you've done, I think that's an important piece.
Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you three very, very much. Now let's open it up to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? We'll have 2 microphones, 1 on each side, floating around. So over to Gavin.
Thank you. Have you come up with any solutions for rising damp in your foundations?
So the Penhallow house that I talked about, that's an integral part of it. And, I will say, we had mechanical engineers working on this project and we're kind of going it alone, but this is what we're going to do. The space is going to be sealed, that space with the large gravel bed in it. But we need to be able to control relative humidity. So we're going to have an industrial dehumidification system on the first floor that will circulate air through that crawl space to try to keep it dry. We'll also have a moisture membrane on the top as well. But that's our solution, is to keep that airflow moving and try to dry it out, especially in between flood events like you saw the slide. Otherwise, it really, like I said, groundwater is really a case-by-case situation, and Strawberry Bank has a very low area of elevation, and it eventually creases both to the north and to the south, and so the amount of groundwater impact lessens and the humidity levels decrease. So we don't have to do so much. We don't have to have that industrial dehumidification system. We might get away with simply a moisture membrane. So it's really a case-by-case.
Yeah, I guess if I'm going to add that, we haven't done anything quite like what Rodney has been doing, but we haven't faced anything quite like what Rodney's facing. So, right now we're not trying to stop rising damp or anything like that. We're just trying to make sure the drainage is good, that the conditions are good around the house. In the basement, we have, sump pumps. We might be treating basement air to dehumidify it. but the next issue is that groundwater is creeping up there. It's getting higher and higher, and so that will become, you know, the next issue probably for us in terms of that water management, is that we're now competing, like Rodney, with where the water level is below the buildings.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could address, I know this is mostly about, you know, the water and what's happening, but the sort of aesthetic, like where Marblehead has an old and historic districts commission that doesn't want X, Y, or Z done because it changes the look of the house. Like if you, so most of this probably is hidden because it's in basements or whatever, but you must be dealing with that dialectic even before you start thinking about whether you're going to put in heat pumps or some of the other things going forward. But how do you balance that? You mentioned you had it, for instance, a dehumidifier on the first floor of that historic building. Is that considered, I don't know, ugly for the people that might be coming to tour the building? Or so just wondering how you balance it.
Well, I mean, I think that is the problem. I mean, historic preservation is supposed to be about very little change, and if you do make change, make it reversible. But I think Ben touched on the fact that maybe we need to be starting to look at something a little bit differently, that in order to make our buildings, our historic buildings, and preserve them, to make them resilient, we're going to have to take bigger and bigger steps. So I think we will have that dehumidification system in a utility room on the first floor that no one's ever going to see. So I think that's, you know, a trade-off. If I were a betting man with some of our other buildings that are even closer to the river than the Penhallow House, I think we're probably going to lose the basement altogether. So in order to maintain as much of the look of the house, we will lift it up, pour a concrete pad, set it back down at the same elevation, use the stones from the existing foundation as a veneer. So the look is going to be exactly the same, and that veneer is now your buffer from water encroachment. You know, it's a compromise. We're now going to lose the basement. We're going to lose the original arch supports for the chimneys. You know, anything that's down there is going to be gone, but the house is going to be saved. So there's the balance.
So the Portland Historic Preservation Commission is fairly liberal. They recently, within the last couple of years, approved a restaurant on the waterfront, which was having multi-day tidal flooding of their restaurant kitchen, which is in the basement right on the water. They needed to move the kitchen and fill it in. And, you know, the Historic Preservation Commission, although, you know, they didn't want to see all that comes with a kitchen at the grade level, did approve that project. They've also approved heat pumps on a regular basis, and they also approved solar panels, because ultimately we can't lose a building because we don't want to see a heat pump outside. I mean, we have to look at the bigger picture, and some small changes in the meantime hopefully will mean bigger results down the road.
Yeah, I know for Historic New England. So Ben and I were on the property care team. We also have a visitor experience team, and so they're the ones that do day-to-day site management and do interpretation and hire the guides and do all of that. So it's definitely for us a collaborative effort, and it's almost like a necessary evil. Like if a guest on a tour points out the dehumidifier, we can explain to them, you know, we have these issues, but this is how we're trying to deal with it right now, and it's a little unsightly, and obviously they didn't have it in the 1800s, but it's for the best for the building, and 99.99% of the time they're a-okay with it, and they can kind of just in their minds just kind of erase it from being in the space.
You were talking about how, you know, everybody helps each other out and networking. I have to say that because all of you are doing such incredible work in researching, especially you, Ben, because you have so much resources to do a lot of data and research, having that available is absolutely phenomenal. And from my perspective, I'm working on the Salem Athenaeum doing mitigation. Gutters are built into the cornice, and I quoted liberally from your white paper on gutters, making a petition to the Historic Commission about why we needed more downspouts. So I just say,
you know, you're all doing good work, and having it available to everybody here is a great advantage for everybody, so I appreciate that.
Speaking of gutters, I have a question about what sort of calculations, if any, that you do to, design gutters for the future.
Well, gutters for the future, I think, gutters for the future. I'm gonna steal that at some point, I don't know why, but all right, so now you're gonna make me have to remember. I think when, there's a standard set of calculations for measuring your capacity of the gutter, and it's based on, slope of your roof, the amount of space in the roof, but also what are the, I forget what they use, but there's a trigger point storm that they're using the data from to calculate that. And I think it was like a 10-year storm or something like that. And so I think I don't have a finite answer for that, but I would say, we were looking at what, the data would suggest, not a 10-year storm, but maybe you look at the, 50-year storm and base it on that. But that was just, we don't have analytics based on that. It's just, you have to understand the calculation to begin with, and then, make your judgments on kind of where you think you're going to be in the future, or if it's a wood gutter, we're going to have to replace the wood gutter in 20 years anyway, so you don't have to over plan for super future. You're just planning for the near future and some of this. That all being said, there's only so big you can make a wood gutter, because it just becomes too unwieldy, too big, too heavy, and too kind of out of scale. But that opens the door for, replicating it in copper and, painting it white so it looks like the wood gutter. There's a lot of different strategies to get more out of it. I kind of danced around that because I couldn't remember the exact formula that we came up with, but I think it was if you're calculating based on the 10-year storm, we were just saying if that's what standards say, then you should go to, you should make your own decision, 20, 30, 40-year storm for that calculation.
I will tell you one thing that we're trying, totally experimental. I'm not recommending you do it. I'm absolutely not recommending you do it, but we're trying it. On the Yetton Walsh house that we restored a couple of years ago, our restoration carpenter put up a new wooden gutter with 2 downspouts in the corners, but he didn't put any end caps on. So the idea is the downspouts will handle the water on a typical storm, but if we get an inundation and it can't keep up, rather than having it back up and cascade over, it's going to shoot out the ends. And so you have to, obviously you have to make sure your pitch is right. You have to make sure it's cascading away from the foundation. There's lots of other things to consider, but we're just we're playing around a little with it and see if it works.
Hi, I'm just a homeowner here, but I had lots of water in my circa 1700s cellar, and I just directed the water, all the water from the downspouts into rain barrels 12 feet from the house. And when I was a kid, my brother and I thought there was an underground river. There wasn't. That's 95% of the water is just gone just by doing that. Plus I have water that I can use to water my yard with, and I don't have to pay the city for water. Low-hanging fruit.
I think that's great, and that's exactly what I think the first thing you always need to figure out is where is that water coming from, right? Is it tidal, is it groundwater, or is it bad drainage? That helps inform your repair solution, and you figured it out and was successful.
And one other thing, I'm kind of in a low spot, so I thought I invented something. It turns out there's a name for it. It's called an air drain. I couldn't do, what do you call them, French drains, because there was nowhere for the water to go. So I just dug down 1.5 feet and put 3 layers of landscape cloth, some gravel, 4-inch perforated pipe, more gravel, wrapped it around, And it doesn't make that much difference because almost all that water was coming from the roof. But whatever does come down when it rains, it all just goes away. And it didn't cost anything. I mean, it cost a few $100.
Any other questions? I know I have one. A little interest of mine is kind of pairs well with preservation is archaeology. When it comes time to do any subsurface work, how do you guys prepare for that? And has anything you've ever found help dictate the project, like changing the route of French drain or doing anything like that?
I have the mic, so as Christina knows, sometimes our projects stretch out quite a bit because you do the planning, and at this stage, for us, it's safe just to allow a full year for the archaeological process because there's going to be, the state just getting the permit from the state, and then the archaeologist doing the work, writing the report, then the state reviewing the findings from the report. All of that takes like 8-9 months. So you got to build it in right from the beginning of the project and understand you have this majorly important phase that could affect what your drainage is. And on more than one occasion, we've had to figure out how to reroute the subsurface aspects of it. And sometimes we, even with the archaeologists, we would say, well, let's put a pin in this until we're actually at construction, and the archaeologists would be there during excavation so that we could get the right path through kind of over a resource. It was a funny resource that we were going through, but we could do that, and so the archaeologists guided that process.
What he said. No. The one example I'll give you is the Penhallow house. It turns out that 2 to 3 feet below that house, I told you it was moved there in the 1850s, it was actually put on what we believe was the equivalent of a spillway for the water that was traveling from the puddle dock to the South Mill Pond. There's a round granite cobble feature that goes underneath the entire house and even extends another 30 feet to the east. So we think they were trying to manage the water as it was traveling through the neighborhood and heading toward the South Mill Pond. Obviously, we didn't want to disturb that in all of the work that you saw we were doing, so we designed the foundation around that feature. We didn't go any lower than the top of that feature. And that was a huge challenge for the structural engineer because usually you go below frost, and we couldn't do that. So how to do that? So Strawberry Bank is a very, very sensitive archaeological site, and it's something we have to consider for anything we consider in putting a shovel in the ground. So.
Hello, this is Joie from Historic New England, and I actually don't have a question, but I just wanted to share an additional resource, a couple additional resources if people are looking for it. In terms of collaboration, if you're in the Boston area, there's a group called the Cultural Institutions Working Group, which came out of the GRC's collaborative climate action planning process, which I also highly recommend. Historic New England went through it. And if you are looking to start climate action planning but don't really know where to begin, it's a great place to start. And then the Cultural Institutions Working Group meets quarterly, and it's cultural institutions in the greater Boston area that come together to basically do that, share information, share resources. We're in the process of formalizing our structure a little bit more, but if anyone's interested in finding out more about that, you can come find me, or I think you might be able to just Google it too, but if you want to come find me, you can. And then Massachusetts does have a lot of great resources for flood mapping and such, but if you are not in Massachusetts or you're not in a state that has done that work, there is a great website called Climate Resilience Resources for Cultural Heritage, which was done by Environment and Culture Partners. And it brings together, among other things, it has a wonderful mapping tool that brings together information from NOAA, FEMA, and Climate Check, and a bunch of other resources. So if you want to go in and put in your address and see how your area might be impacted, it's a wonderful resource. So thanks, that's all.
I'll add one more resource for Massachusetts, and it's called COSTEP, Massachusetts. I have to remember the name. Coordinated Statewide Emergency Preparedness for Cultural Heritage in Massachusetts. They've been funded by FEMA and MEMA, and they're coordinating at a kind of a higher statewide level, but I think they have a lot of resources. They have some webinars, some on their website coming up this fall, so.
Thank you for the plug. I'm on the executive committee for COSTEP, and actually I'm going to say it's an all-volunteer group, but we rely heavily on our partners in MEMA and FEMA for that. And coming up very soon, there's a webinar on climate action planning, of which I'm presenting at. So sign up. It's free.
Any other questions? I have another one. Julie, do you know of any buildings in the greater Portland area that have either been elevated or relocated?
Not for climate purposes. As I mentioned, there, that particular restaurant filled in their basement. A couple buildings down, there was a second basement that had noticeable structural shifting, and when they got down into it, they determined that the basement was flooding twice a day. The tide was going through the basement into Commercial Street, which is our waterfront street, which is filled. It was a filled street. And then what it was doing was when the tide was receding, it's bringing the sediment from Commercial Street into the basement, dropping it into the basement of the building, which was impacting the forces on the foundation wall. So we're seeing projects like that immediately right on the water that are having significant structural issues and may need to do significant structural work in their basements. We're also seeing a lot of downslope flooding coming from parking lots and things like that, where people are having to make adjustments to the perimeters of their building on the waterfront. And we also, during storm surges, have a lot of the outlets for the drainage are too low, and so we have backup that comes back up into the city, which is exacerbating some of the rainfall, the flooding from rainfall and tidal flooding.
Does the city have a stance on those types? If a building did need to be elevated or relocated, how do you think the city would feel about that?
So we're currently rewriting our land use code, which includes the historic preservation ordinance, and we put moving buildings within an existing district as a permissible activity, which the state is giving a little pushback on. And we talked to them about why that might be important to do in some of our waterfront communities. Yeah.
One question back there?
Just a quick, is this working? Is this working? Yeah, okay. Just a quick comment to the person who asked about rising damp. The SPAB in London has a ton of information to help with that. The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, that they're really into it.
I know we mentioned a lot of Massachusetts resources, which obviously we're in Massachusetts. I'm not sure if there's a lot of Maine people here, but Julie, do you know of any resources for Maine people? Or Rodney for New Hampshire?
In terms of, okay, so the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, mainly because they've been funding a lot of the work that Historic New England and Greater Portland Landmarks has been doing. There's also a statewide organization called Maine Preservation that has been doing some work around this issue. But all three entities are mainly the big preservation-focused entities. The state itself is doing a lot of climate action planning and preparedness. We had the same significant storms that Massachusetts had last winter, and so there's been a lot of focus on waterfront communities, and as well as historic fish piers and bridges and things like that that were impacted.
One organization in New Hampshire is the New Hampshire Coastal Adaptation Work Group, which is a volunteer organization of University of New Hampshire professionals, state employees, museum folk. It's growing all the time, but a really good resource. They maintain a website. We meet quarterly, I think. So that's one. And then the university itself is also a pretty good resource. They've got some things on their website. We're partnering with the geospatial department as part of our groundwater study that Ben mentioned. And the city of Portsmouth, actually, just a couple weeks ago, became a partner in that process by putting forward $50,000 to expand our ground monitoring system. So again, it's really community-based. So universities, cities, municipality websites, and CAW is a great source.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? All right, any other final comments, guys? All right, thank you, Ben, Rodney, and Julie.
Okay, so many thanks to our panelists, moderator Christina, and thank you to Rodney and Julie and Ben for all this information, and it seems like a really productive Q&A session. It's now time for a break, so I'm going to say stretch your legs and please be back in the auditorium by 2:35. So that we can start session number 4, which will be Climate Mitigation Solutions, Decarbonizing Historic Buildings Through Electrification.